I believe in Jesus, by the way. We'll talk about that.
Oh.
I'm reading The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. It's convincing evidence.
What do you think? I throw people out of the club here? We believe in whatever you want.
I didn't. I went to Catholic school my whole life, but after reading this book, Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, the factual evidence that he existed is kind of overwhelming.
Bill Maher has been in comedy for quite some time at this point. Christ DiStefano is an up-and-comer. He has a big podcast. He's really starting to show up on a lot of the circuits. I'm not sure if he's put a special out yet or not. He might have 5 special. Might be still on this. I'm new to Christ DiStefano. I'm probably saying his name wrong also.
Wow.
He sat down with Bill Maher on Bill's podcast Club Random. They talked about a lot of things, but it was clear that Chris came wanting to talk to Bill about Jesus. And part of that is because Bill Maher is one of the more famous atheists in entertainment. In fact, about 10, 15 years ago, he put out an entire documentary called Religious, which was just an attempt to make religion, and specifically Christianity, look as asinine and foolish as possible. Now, what we're going to see is Bill Maher is kind of the most dangerous atheist because he doesn't mind arguing about it. And the only thing that matches his arrogance on the topic of Christianity is his ignorance on the topic of Christianity.
Wow.
So when you have someone who's very arrogant and very ignorant, they're very difficult to communicate with. So we're going to look at a few clips from this conversation. I absolutely love how Chris starts it out. He just goes, I believe in Jesus. And we're going to walk through this. This might be a little bit of a longer section because I want to take it apart. I want to really look at it and look at the arguments that are being made. And I'm also just encouraged that Chris is becoming a very famous person. It's a very well-known comedian, is having these conversations.
I believe in Jesus, by the way. We'll talk about that.
Oh.
I'm reading The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. It's convincing evidence.
What do you think? I throw people out of the club here? We believe in whatever you want.
I didn't. I went to Catholic school my whole life, but after reading this book, Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, the factual evidence that he existed is kind of overwhelming.
So if you don't know, Lee Strobel is an apologist who had a massive influence, not just in the apologetics arena, but just in Christianity more generally. There was a movie made about him a few years ago. I believe Strobel was an investigative journalist. He was an atheist. He started looking into Christianity as an investigative journalist and came to the conclusion that Jesus was real. He really did die. He actually rose again. And Lee Strobel became a believer in Jesus through this process. And he's written a series of books. One of them, probably the most famous, being The Case for Christ.
I'd like to see that because the factual evidence that he existed has always been underwhelming. In fact, it's always...
Read A Case for Christ.
Yeah, I
Give
will.
it a shot by Lee Strobel.
This is based on what? Archaeological finds?
Archaeological finds,
New ones?
theological finds, Ivy League.
What are theological finds?
Bill, ready for this?
Yeah.
If I told you, okay, if I told you factual evidence about Alexander the Great, you would believe me.
Okay, but even still, it's a silly point because who cares if Jesus lived? It's whether he's then died and was reborn and is up in heaven with his Father, who's really him. Okay. That's the part where the rubber meets the road. Maybe he existed. I agree. That's absolutely possible. Fine. He may have existed.
But according to Case for Christ, independent sources who didn't know each other, who wrote about him within 20 years of his death, talked about these miracles happening as in real time.
Okay. Well, again.
And Alexander the Great's biographers, the earliest one was like 100 years after he died.
Chris, I'm going to have to burst your bubble now because I have to spit a couple of facts at you.
All right. So now Bill Maher is going to spit a couple of facts. And this is where we see just the confidence and the lack of credible content come into play as Bill is going to make his cases. And we're going to look at a few of them in turn.
They're kind of under. Okay. There's only 2 sources in the Bible. There's the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Okay. There's also another guy, Josephus, who wasn't accepted, but read The Case for Christ.
Not in the Bible.
Okay.
But the Bible is itself an anthology. They found some few decades ago the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were other books that were just basically edited out. So right away, we know a person decided what constituted the Bible, and just some stuff wound up on the cutting room floor.
Okay, so is that true? Did finding the Dead Sea Scrolls a few decades ago, does that actually delegitimize the scriptures that we call the Bible, the Old and New Testament? Now, remember, the conversation is whether or not Jesus existed. Bill claims that there is a lot of people who really question. It's very questionable whether Jesus lived or not. You can look that up for yourself. But many of the most just strident atheists who are completely against this, Bart Ehrman comes to mind, will even say, like, everyone knows Jesus actually lived. There was a Nazarene carpenter named Jesus who traveled around and taught. What is in question, like Bill does say accurately, is whether or not he was the Jesus we believe in, the Jesus who could do miracles, who was crucified and rose again, the Jesus who is God in human flesh. Now, he makes his first point about the Dead Sea Scrolls, about the conversation of Jesus. The problem is the Dead Sea Scrolls contain the Old Testament, not the New Testament. The Dead Sea Scrolls have some of the oldest fragments of the Jewish scriptures, what we call the Old Testament of our Bible. There were other writings in there from this sect of people who lived in that area, but none of those are scripture. None of those meet the qualifications for what we see as scripture. They do give us insight into what it was like living in a Jewish area in that time. But more than anything, the Dead Sea Scrolls were some of the greatest evidence for the veracity of what we have in our Old Testament. And it really says nothing about what we believe about the validity of Jesus as a real person or the validity of Jesus in his divinity. And so let's look at the next argument that he's going to make.
I'm with you on that.
But here's the important point.
What's up?
There's only these 5
A
sources.
little bit more tequila, that's it.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
I'm wrecked right now.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Good boys.
Not contemporaries of Jesus. Not even close. Matthew.
Okay.
So they lived from 70 to 110 years after him.
I understand.
No. From 40 to 70 years.
But they got their information from Josephus, who lived about 10 years after Jesus.
So already we're into a game of telephone. Okay.
Bill, yes, but
the other
I want to make you let your point, but let me just quickly. The game of telephone, yes, I agree with you that point. But the game of telephone in Jesus's times, according to Lee Strobel in the case of Christ, was the simple fact of we're playing the game of telephone. There's 10 people here. The game of telephone, as we know it today, is you say something in my ear and then it goes around 10 times. And by the time it gets to you, it's something radically different. This game of telephone, this ancient game of telephone was, but you tell it to me, then the third guy confirms what you said before it goes to the fourth guy. So there's a level of checking checks and balances.
Chris, you're working.
So I love how prepared Chris came. It is obvious, and he's not hiding the ball. This is all new to him. He's just exploring it. He says some things in here that aren't, quite on the nose accurate, and that's fine. He's having a good conversation about things that he's learning, and I love watching it. Bill Maher is just wrong about some of these things, and these are the talking points of an atheist 20, 30, 40 years ago. The more all the different areas of investigation, the historicity, the archaeology, science, all the data that we have, ancient literature, the more all of these disciplines progress, the more evidence we have for the validity and veracity of what we see in the Old and New Testament. Outside of the 4 Gospels, you have Josephus, Tacitus, and Pliny the Younger, who all directly reference Jesus, Christians, those are the followers of Jesus, and their beliefs. And there are multiple other philosophers and historians and other writers who make indirect references, and some of them direct references. These are contemporaries of Jesus and the movement of Jesus who are living in the ancient world, who are talking openly about Jesus and his movement that he started and the beliefs of that. Outside of that, Christianity, unlike other religions, didn't sit down and write a religious book. Everything we have in the New Testament were documents that were widely disseminated through the ancient world and were based off eyewitness testimony, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then you have the book of Acts, which is the history of the early church, also written by Luke. These were documents that were compiled just like other documents from the ancient world. The only difference is, and this is part of what you learn from Lee Strobel and from other apologists, and you could learn if you do your own investigation, is that like Alexander the Great or like the emperors of Rome, there is historical documentation about the life of Jesus. One of the ways that you establish the veracity of ancient documents is how close they were recorded to the events of the actual person's life. Chris made the point earlier that Alexander the Great, the earliest writings we have, come over 100 years after he had died. The documents about Jesus are much, much closer, as even Bill will admit when he starts talking about the Apostle Paul here in just a moment. The other way you establish veracity is the number of documents and the number of copies of those documents. And when you look at the documents of the New Testament, they absolutely dwarf anything from the ancient world. And it's because people actually believed what was in those documents, and they could trace them back to the eyewitnesses who watched Jesus die and then hung out with him later. Current New Testament scholars believe the documents in the New Testament were most, if not all of them, written prior to 70 AD, because in 70 AD, you have this seminal event where Emperor Titus comes in and destroys Jerusalem, and it's not referenced in the New Testament. The New Testament are written by Jewish men. That was the biggest historical moment in that entire time frame, and it's never even mentioned. It's not mentioned in the Gospels. It's not mentioned in the epistles. Some people believe it's referenced, if anywhere, in Revelation, which we know was an older document because it was written at the end of John's life. He's just wrong about the facts surrounding the New Testament, and now he's going to make his most egregious argument yet. And so let's look at this last clip together.
So
you think they'll like me?
St. Paul.
Good guy, St. Paul, a.k.a. Saul, and the capital of Minnesota.
Is the other source of the Bible.
Yes.
There's Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. I said the two names out of order because that's the order in the Bible. The first gospel, Mark, is 70 AD. Jesus dies in 33. So that's 40 years almost after he died.
Okay.
So not contemporaries. Paul comes
by ancient standards, contemporaries. By ancient standards, some of the closest documentation to the actual event that we have for any ancient historical figure. So just keep that in mind.
For the gospel writers, he's writing around the year 50, in the 50s.
Okay.
So he's much closer to Jesus's time. So you'd think he would know more about Jesus than the people who came later. But actually, St. Paul knows almost nothing about Jesus. He barely conceives of him as as a person who lived on earth. There's no details about his life like they are in the Gospels. So the people who came later know more than the person who wrote earlier. Just some food for thought.
But, okay, I understand. But he does acknowledge at some point, right? Paul, aka Saul, knows that Jesus existed, right? He talks about him.
He talks about, I'm saying he conceives him as a Godhead. He doesn't have this, it's not the narrative that's in the Gospels of Jesus went around and he did miracles and he did stuff and everybody loved him and he gets quoted a lot. He makes speeches, blessed are the meek. You know, he has adventures. He goes into the desert. It's a whole thing.
But what about?
And then at the end, it's a whole drama with, he's crucified. Oh, no. Paul doesn't know any of this. All this.
Okay, so remember that. Paul doesn't know any of this. He doesn't know that Jesus came to earth bodily. He doesn't know about the crucifixion and the resurrection. He doesn't believe that Jesus was an actual man. He just thinks he was a part of the Godhead. He admits Paul is writing much earlier. He's writing maybe in the 50s. And we know through the book of Acts, we can trace Paul's missionary journeys. And here's the first mistake he's making. What Bill's argument actually is that I want the epistles to also be the gospels. The gospels are narrative. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are synoptic gospels. They give a synopsis of the life of Jesus. They are telling a narrative, looking backwards, telling a narrative. John's gospel is a salvific gospel. He tells us at the end of his document, I have written this so you may believe. So that's the point of his gospel. Then you have the book of Acts, also written by Luke, which is a history of the early church. The majority of the rest of the New Testament are epistles written by Paul, written by Peter, written by James. And epistles are just letters. They're actual letters sent back to the churches that they had helped to start. Because they're letters, they're not telling a narrative. Paul isn't writing a gospel to send to Ephesus. He's not writing a gospel to send to Corinth or Philippi or Thessalonica or Berea. What he's writing are letters. He's giving instruction. He's edifying the church. He's challenging them on their behaviors. He's correcting them. He's writing letters. They've already heard the gospel from him. They've heard the story of the life of Jesus when he first showed up to town and shared the gospel with them. He doesn't need to rewrite that. There's the Gospels. Now he has the epistle. And we know this because that's what he says. He actually says this. So Bill Maher says he's not really even aware of the gospel story. And yet in 1 Corinthians 15, here's what Paul writes to the church in Corinth. Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you have believed in vain. So what is the gospel he preached when he showed up? He said, for what I received, I passed on to you as first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. And after that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and then to all the apostles. And last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. So not only is Paul saying exactly what Bill says he doesn't have any recollection of, that he showed up to town and preached the gospel, the story of Jesus and the good news of his life. Then he recaps the cornerstone of the gospel, reminding them, here's what I shared when I first showed up to you guys, because the Corinthians were questioning the resurrection of the dead at the end of time. Paul is saying, I've already taught you all this. I've already walked through this with you. Not only that, but then he nails his assertion to eyewitnesses. And so, like Bill said, he's writing this in 50 AD. He's writing this 15 years after Christ rose from the dead. He's saying, you can get on a boat from Corinth, take a journey into Jerusalem, and there are 500 eyewitnesses to the risen Jesus. What he is saying is, fact check me, bro. Get on a boat and fact check me. The gospel I shared with you is real. Bill also says that Paul did not conceive of Jesus as a physical person, that he was just kind of this Godhead that just existed. And this is called Docetism. This is an ancient heresy. The entire letter that we have in the New Testament called 1 John is written to the church that John pastored. And it is directly attacking this line of thought that Jesus was spiritual only and not physical. Paul also talks about that to the church in Colossae in Colossians chapter 1, where he says this, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him, all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he's the head of the body, the church. He's the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, okay, that's fine, but all of that is very spiritual language. You know, maybe Bill has a point. Maybe Paul really just thought that there wasn't some corporeal body that Jesus lived in, the hypostatic union, 100% God and 100% man. Maybe Paul didn't hold to that. But hang on. There's more. In verse 21, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. So we have both of them there. Paul saying, you guys know the gospel. That's what I preached when I showed up. That's why you believed. And he says, almost like anticipating this argument, that he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body. And Bill Maher is saying very confidently that Paul doesn't believe in that. Paul doesn't know the story of Jesus. Paul is this completely different thing, and he wrote the majority of the New Testament. Here's the problem, that there are so many atheists who do not begin with the facts and then make their way to whether or not they believe. They start with a desire to not believe for whatever reason, a desire to not submit, even if it might be real. And for Bill Maher to be such an ardent atheist that he has put up money to create an entire documentary trying to dissuade people from Christ and to not know the simplest facts about the gospel really does prove the uphill battle that we are often in. First Peter, this is Peter writing to his church. He says, in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord and always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. And so I don't know where Chris DiStefano is. I don't know if he has become a believer. If he has, he's doing the work. And maybe he can't perfectly articulate all of the things in what he's reading for the case for Christ. But he's doing the work and he's having the conversations. And if he's not a believer, it should really wake us up. As a believer, if you could not sit there with Bill Maher hearing his facts that he's going to spit at you and have some answers for that, which are actually pretty simple answers, then we need to study to show ourselves approved. We need to be ready in season and out of season to give a reasoned answer for the faith that we have. It's more than possible. And if you really just with an open mind and open heart, assess the evidence for who Jesus was and what he accomplished. And if Jesus actually walked out of a tomb, really died and really rose again, then you should consider putting your faith in him. If you enjoyed this clip, make sure you check out the full podcast and subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay up to date with all new content. You can also support the channel at patreon.com/Clayton Tyner. Link is in the description below.